Hey, you remember the game Hollow Knight? Nah, you probably don't. It only had uh, how many sales? That reaction is real, by the way. I just looked that up as I was saying it, and 15 million. Oh my gosh. But with 15 million and counting sales, you're bound to have a lot of people who are disappointed. You're also going to have the haters, but, no one's really counting those. But what I find interesting is that a lot of people who leave a disappointed review tend to say it's like a 7 out of 10 game, or they just say like the game's fine, but it's massively overrated, which, they usually just say 7 out of 10 anyways. But I find that really interesting. I'm not disappointed in the game personally, but I would also give it a 7 out of 10, and I mean like a real 7, as in if 5 is average, because, that's in the middle of the scale, I would give it a 7 because I think it's decently above average. It's not a perfect game, but it's a good one. It's very competent. By the way, this video is going to be pretty much spoiler free. The footage is of about the first hour of the game, maybe hour and a half. And the game is a very long game. I think my first playthrough was 30 to 50 hours. So if you haven't played it, you can still get something out of this video, and maybe you can even use it as a recommendation on if you would like it. Now, I want to talk about why people like the game before I start to critique it, and I'm going to be leaving out a very particular reason, so I hope that you can bear with me here, because I will circle back to that one reason later, I promise. So the biggest thing that I've seen people compliment the game on, and this is actually one of the biggest compliments I personally would give the game, is the boss fights. They have really fun cycles, and then the patterns of their attacks in general are really fun. There's this concept that people at Bungie called the dance when they were working on Halo, which is kind of the cadence and the movements of combat. I think they really nailed that feeling of the dance, especially with bosses like the Mantis Lords and Nightmare King Grim. Those are two of my favorite fights in the game, and maybe even in games as a whole. It's definitely like top 50 for me. I've seen some people really praise the level design. There's still backtracking in the game to a degree, but it's mitigated by a lot of these smaller loops that interconnect these levels between each other and even inside of themselves. I'm pretty sure the very first area of the game had, I think it was 3 loops. And this constant looping is very interesting because if you feel like you've strayed too far from your original path and you wanted to take a different route, usually you'll just loop back around to that area anyways and you can take that other path that you wanted. It makes exploring feel really rewarding because you get to make progress and you get to go back to your original position. I'm starting to split hairs at this point because people talk about these less and less as I'm going through these bullet points, but people really do like the upgrades. They change how you see the world, and they're really well paced out, and they're given out at the right order too, I think. They give you the dash far before they give you the double jump. At least if you're playing the game in its proper sequence, because the game does allow you to sequence break. Something that you might be thinking to yourself when you hear all of this, especially if you haven't played the game yet, is that this kind of just sounds like all good Metroidvania games, right? Like, I can't think of a single one that I've played that didn't do any of these things. And this is why people tend to be so critical or so negative of the game, aside from the obvious contrarians. So why do people give it a 7 out of 10, even if they don't like it? And why do so many people like it in the first place? Now this might seem like a bit of a lame answer, so hear me out. This is also that bullet point I was talking about earlier, where there's that one glaring, obvious reason why people like this game, and it is the presentation. You might be thinking, well, duh, obviously the art is really pretty. I love the art style. And that is true, but I think it goes even deeper than that, right? Like, it can't just be the art style, because there's plenty of games that are pretty to look at, but no one really cares that much about in the end. Let me give some examples of what I'm thinking of here. To get the music out of the way, it is really pretty, just like the art style is, but it's subdued. I can't remember too many tracks in the game, outside of, maybe boss themes, that use drums. And I think it's subdued like that to let the really punchy sound effects carry the gameplay, because the gameplay is pretty standard. I noticed when I was replaying the game for this video that there's a lack of momentum when you're walking. Like if you turn while you're walking at full speed in one direction, it just cuts to the other. And when you go from a walk from a stand, you just instantly gain all your momentum. It doesn't ramp up at all. But this is disguised really well by some great animation work, where it feels like you're kicking off and gaining that momentum naturally anyways. It's the same thing with jumping. Jumping feels very fluid because of the animations and the flowy parts of the character's design. It's not actually because of the programming or anything like that, because that seems pretty standard. It just applies force up and then applies force down. There's no real fancy physics or anything going on there. Something else you might not have noticed is that the level design, as in on like a programming level, is very blocky. There's no slopes in the game. There's no ramps, there's no inclines, there's nothing like that. It's all squares, or rectangles I suppose. And it's not even a bad thing because they cover it up so well with these foreground and these background parallax sprites. It really makes you feel like you're walking on an uneven surface, even though there's not a single uneven surface in the game from my recollection. This really shines in areas like Green Path, the second major area of the game, where they have all of this foliage that is so rounded just by nature, you know, that's just how bushes and trees look. And that really adds to the overall shape of these levels from being very blocky, straight paths into something with so much more of a natural, tangible shape that you can really stick in your brain and know that you've been in that room before, which is kind of a big problem that a lot of other Metroidvanias have, is when they lean into this more blocky, slopeless design for their games, you can kind of forget what room you're even in. And that's not really so much a problem in this game. I find myself recollecting what these places are as soon as I return to them. Upgrades are also flavored in really fun ways that kind of fit that bug theme, so it doesn't really feel so much like you got the double jump. You got the wings that give you a little extra vertical thrust. And they just feel good to use as well. The dash that you get very early on has these really nice animations where your cape kind of flows out behind you when you do the dash. And usually there's some really nice particle effects that accompany that to really kind of sell that burst of speed that you got from the ability. The game's maps, like not the level design, I mean the actual maps that you go out and you buy from the vendor and then have to kind of chart the rest out yourself, those seem like they're hand-drawn by the artist, and that really makes you feel a lot more immersed in the game. Like it really sells the idea that some other guy in the world drew this map for you and then you're drawing the rest out yourself. And then the idea with the pins being flavored well as pins really help a lot with that kind of vibe, because then you have the other end of the spectrum, which are games like Super Metroid, where they just kind of have that map plopped in the corner of your screen, and they're just squares or rectangles or whatever. It feels a lot less diegetic, right? But going back to the actual level design, there's a lot of variety within those levels on this asset scale, where those bouncy mushrooms in the caves of going up to the Mantis Lords, I don't recall any two of them looking the same. It looks like they drew a lot of different ones just so those caverns would feel a bit more lush and a little bit more varied from room to room. It does a lot to cover a lack of mechanical variety, because that cave area of the game has two main mechanics, which are the bouncy mushrooms and the water. And I mean, I'm kind of splitting hairs with the water too, so it's mostly just the bouncy mushrooms, at least when you first enter it. And one main gimmick mechanically usually would not be enough to support an entire area of a Metroidvania, but again, the aesthetics of it go such a long way of propping that up and making it feel a lot better than it probably otherwise would. And I don't mean to just give props to the animator and the artist. I think the programmer did a lot of great work on his front too. I mean, to do some of those special particle effects, I'm sure he had to do some of the programming for that. But even beyond that, the game is really solidly made. I don't recall ever having any glitches when I played the game. And as silly of a point as that is, I mean, a lot of people will just push a game out and they'll just patch out the glitches later on, or they'll leave some in. I mean, look at Bethesda games. It's so hard to be immersed in those sometimes just because of how glitchy and buggy those things can run. But I didn't really experience anything like that when I played. And again, I have 40, 50 hours in the game, so that deserves a lot of praise too. Mechanical complexity does not necessarily mean much when the game is buggy, and so them having a more simple game mechanically means that they were able to really iron out any bugs that they could have had, and I think that's great. I can appreciate the approach of polish over ambition, even though the game is still ambitious, especially from an artistic standpoint, like I said. But I think that their approach of having these smaller quantities of mechanics and patterns for bosses and enemies, and just having a lot of variety between each one, really pays off a lot more than them trying to be ambitious with fewer mechanics but trying to spread that out across a larger game like this. They did a really good job. And of course, I also have to mention the NPCs and the bosses themselves have lots of personality, especially through their animations and their voice lines. They're all so memorable, even after not playing the game since, I want to say 2019, 2020. When I came back to record it for this video, I recognize so many characters immediately, and I recognize so many of their voice lines that they make, especially Hornet when you fight her for the first time. And then lastly, I want to mention this just because I feel like I'll have someone mentioning it if I don't. There's also the lore. I know a lot of people care a lot about the lore of this game, but if it was just that and people loved the game just for the lore, I don't think people would have bought it as much as they did. I don't think it would have sold 15 million copies if people just cared about the lore, because then they would just watch the YouTube videos. You know, they wouldn't have played the game. Who knows though, maybe you're one of those people. Maybe you are watching videos about the game instead of playing it. No, you wouldn't be one of those people, would you? So it has a lovely presentation. So what? Well, it kind of means everything for the game. It doesn't do anything particularly better than the other standouts in the genre. Like, I would still say that Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night, you know, the two games that make up the name of the genre, are better than Hollow Knight in just about every way. But Hollow Knight playing these tropes so earnestly, but putting its own unique flavor on all of them, and then trying to wrap it up in a really nice bow, really sets it apart from every other game in the genre. And it makes it such a beautiful entry point for anyone who hasn't played a Metroidvania before. Like, if you were new to the genre and you asked me what I would want you to play to get a feel for the genre, I would still probably say Super Metroid because I think that one is the best one. But if you're used to modern games, there's no reason not to try Hollow Knight first, especially since you're going to still get a feel for all the tropes, and a feel for how the interconnected maps work, and for the general pace and structure of these games. I think it's a lovely entry point. And if you have played the game, I know that there's a few smaller things I could have mentioned, like the mechanics that they take from Dark Souls and other games that inspired them outside of Metroidvanias. There's some incredible fights and sequences that take place in the game. I could go on and on about the NPCs on their own in detail and all that stuff, but again, I wanted to cover a different perspective on this. I feel like not a lot of people talk about the more minor aspects of the presentation and how that can elevate a game to a higher level and to a higher standard too. That's about it for this video. I've said everything I wanted to say that I don't think everyone else has already talked about for the past 8 years about this game. So, yeah. I think everyone left. According to the metrics of my last video, they left around 5 minutes in. So it's just you and me now. Did you like the video? Did you, subscribe to the thoughts and ideas I portrayed in the video? Yeah, I don't blame you. Bye.